In the final years of the 19th century, when the world still moved at the pace of steamships and railroads, a boy named Juan Trippe was born into a wealthy New Jersey family that could not have imagined how profoundly he would reshape global travel. Born on June 27, 1899, Trippe grew up surrounded by privilege, tradition, and expectations. Yet unlike most sons of American high society, he was captivated not by banking, law, or politics, but by the mysterious new machines that were beginning to rise from the earth on wings. Trippe saw his first air race over New York Harbor when he was 10 years old. The airplanes were fragile, barely controllable, and shockingly loud, but to him they were pure magic. From that moment on, he was convinced that the skies were the future. It was a radical idea at the time. Airplanes were still mostly experimental toys, and aviation killed almost as many young pilots as it thrilled. But Trippe saw what others didn't. He believed aviation would not just become practical, it would become essential. He entered Yale, joined the elite Skull and Bone Society, and seemed destined to follow the conventional path laid out by his family. But the moment the United States entered World War I, he walked away from all of it and volunteered for aviation training. The war ended before he saw combat, but the experience confirmed his conviction that aviation was on the cusp of transforming the world. After the war, aviation in America was dominated by barnstormers, former military pilots performing death-defying stunts at country fairs to earn a few dollars. Trippe wanted something entirely different. He envisioned organized, reliable, safe air transportation, a commercial industry rather than a spectacle. He briefly tried Wall Street, hated it, and in 1923 founded Long Island Airways, a small operation ferrying wealthy New Yorkers to their summer homes. It failed within a year, but it gave Trippe something more valuable than profit: experience. He learned the most important truth of early aviation, a truth that almost no one else grasped. Airlines could not survive on passenger revenue. Flying was too expensive, too dangerous, too limited. The only way to build a sustainable airline was to secure airmail contracts, which guaranteed steady income regardless of how many passengers were on board. That opportunity arrived in 1925 with the Airmail Act, which opened U.S. mail delivery to private companies. Trippe immediately recognized this as the golden ticket. He formed new companies, partnered with wealthy backers, and aggressively sought government contracts. His early attempt, Colonial Air Transport, collapsed after internal disputes. Trippe's ambition was simply too much for his conservative partners. But failure did not slow him down. In 1927, three forces converged to change his fate forever. First, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone in the spirit of St. Louis, becoming the most famous man in the world and igniting a global frenzy for aviation. Second, a small airline called Pan American Airways, founded by military officers to bid on a mail route from Key West to Havana, needed financial support and competent leadership. Third, the U.S. Post Office wanted the competing bidders to merge. Trippe seized the opportunity. His Aviation Corporation of America merged with Pan American and another tiny carrier to form the new consolidated Pan American Airways. Trippe, at just 28 years old, became its president. The airline had no planes capable of handling the route and no runway to depart from, but it had Trippe, whose willpower alone was enough to bend reality. As the deadline for the first official mail flight approached, rain turned the unfinished Key West runway into unusable mud. A lesser man would have asked for a delay. Trippe instead hired a private pilot with a small float plane to carry 7 bags of mail to Havana on time, thus ensuring Pan Am kept the contract. That first 51-minute hop on October 19, 1927 is now legendary in aviation history. The empire had officially begun. From that moment forward, Trippe set his sights not on individual cities, but on entire continents. His strategy was simple yet brilliant. Secure exclusive landing rights and airmail contracts across Central and South America before any competitor could. With a combination of charm, diplomacy, pressure, and the star power of Charles Lindbergh, whom he recruited as a consultant, Trippe negotiated with government after government, securing Pan Am a sprawling network of routes where almost no other airline could operate. What made Pan Am unstoppable in these early years was its fleet of flying boats, especially the Sikorsky S-38. They could land on rivers, bays, lagoons, any stretch of calm water. Latin America lacked airfields, but it had thousands of miles of coastline. For Trippe, this was an advantage, not an obstacle. Passengers, initially only the wealthy elite, dined on real china, sat in wicker armchairs, and experienced aviation as a glamorous adventure. Mail paid the bills, luxury built the mystique. By the early 1930s, Pan American Airways was no longer a small carrier. It was a force, possibly the most ambitious commercial airline the world had ever seen. And the man behind it, Juan Trippe, was just getting started. South America was merely the prologue. The oceans, the world's last great frontiers, were his real goal. The chapter of conquest that Pan Am opened in 1927 would soon expand outward across the globe, transforming not only aviation, but international travel itself. Trippe was ready to attempt what no American airline had ever achieved, to span the oceans and stitch the world together with scheduled, reliable commercial flight. And with that ambition, the age of global aviation was about to begin. By the mid-1930s, Pan American Airways was no longer simply an ambitious airline. It had become a symbol of American reach, innovation, and prestige. But Juan Trippe, restless by nature, viewed everything the company had achieved in Latin America as merely the groundwork for a far grander design. He believed that the true future of aviation lay not in regional routes, nor even continental travel, but in the crossing of oceans. Oceans were nature's last barrier to global mobility, and Trippe intended to tear them down. The challenge was extraordinary. No airline had ever run scheduled commercial service across the world's oceans. Routes were uncertain, distances immense, aircraft underpowered, and navigation technology primitive. In an era before radar, before satellites, before modern weather forecasting, planning a transoceanic airline was closer to a military campaign than a commercial venture. But this only energized Trippe. If South America was a chessboard, then the Pacific and Atlantic were empires waiting to be claimed. And he intended for Pan Am to claim them first. To conquer the oceans, Trippe needed three things: planes that could fly farther than anything built before, landing rights distributed like stepping stones across remote islands, and crews brave enough to test the limits of early aviation. Remarkably, he managed to secure all three. His first strategic target was the Pacific. It was a bolder gamble than the Atlantic, far longer, far emptier, and far less understood. There were almost no civilian airfields between California and Asia. The sheer distance from San Francisco to Hawaii alone was greater than almost any aircraft of the time had flown non-stop. But Trippe saw a solution in the vast but scattered archipelagos of the mid-Pacific. Islands like Honolulu, Midway, Wake, and Guam could serve as vital refueling points, so long as Pan Am could negotiate access to them, and so long as aircraft existed that were capable of reaching them. To build those aircraft, Trippe turned to Igor Sikorsky and the Martin Company, manufacturers of the era's most capable flying boats. Because the Pacific lacked adequate runways, flying boats were the only viable option. They could land in lagoons and harbors, turning natural geography into a global runway. Sikorsky's S-42, sleek, powerful, and unlike anything the public had ever seen, became Trippe's flagship for the Pacific project. But before Pan Am could fly them, it needed a pilot daring enough to push these machines to their limits in the open ocean. That pilot was Edwin Muzik, one of the finest aviators of his generation. Calm, analytical, and extraordinarily gifted, Muzik embodied the professionalism Pan Am wanted to be known for. His test flights across the Pacific in 1935 remain among the most important in the history of aviation. The first major challenge was proving that a heavy, fully fueled flying boat could actually make it from California to Hawaii. On March 23, 1935, Muzik took off from Miami on a long-range test flight across the Atlantic to gather endurance data. Later that year, he would push the limits even further, conducting trial flights between San Francisco and Honolulu under conditions so extreme that even minor miscalculations could have been fatal. The aircraft barely made it on the return trip due to headwinds, landing with fuel levels so low they were considered a near emergency. But Trippe viewed the near disaster as a calculated risk, and Muzik's successful return as proof that the Pacific could be conquered. Meanwhile, Pan Am's engineers were dispatched to tiny Midway and Wake Island, remote specks of coral thousands of miles from mainland civilization. These islands had no fresh water, no natural harbor, and no infrastructure of any kind. Everything had to be shipped in: boats, bulldozers, fuel, radio towers, workers, even the sand for constructing leveled landing platforms in the lagoons. Workers blasted coral reefs with underwater explosives to carve safe landing areas for the clippers. It was one of the most expensive and logistically complex undertakings ever attempted by a private company. Securing legal permissions for this vast operation required diplomacy worthy of a nation-state. Trippe negotiated jointly with the U.S. Navy and the federal government, ultimately convincing President Franklin Roosevelt to transfer control of several strategic Pacific islands specifically so Pan Am could use them. This blending of corporate ambition and geopolitical strategy was unprecedented and controversial, but it worked. By 1935, Pan Am had effectively gained control over the essential steps of a trans-Pacific ladder. On November 22, 1935, after years of planning, the first official Pan Am survey flight across the Pacific departed San Francisco. A Martin M130 flying boat, christened the China Clipper, lifted off the bay and headed west into the longest commercial overwater flight ever attempted. Newspapers followed the journey breathlessly. When the China Clipper finally reached Manila, thousands lined the shore to witness its arrival. America had crossed the Pacific by air. Passenger service soon followed. The experience of flying across the Pacific in the late 1930s was unlike anything else in travel. The Clippers were floating palaces, spacious lounges, private cabins, gourmet meals served on china, and service that rivaled luxury trains and ocean liners. The voyage from San Francisco to Manila took more than 5 days, but for the wealthy few who could afford the fare, around $950, equivalent to more than $20,000 today, it was an unforgettable adventure. These were not merely flights, they were expeditions. With the Pacific secured, Trippe turned to the Atlantic. Here Pan Am faced competition from European airlines and political challenges more complex than those of the Pacific. But Trippe excelled in political combat. He battled regulators, foreign governments, and rival carriers to secure routes from New York to Europe via Newfoundland, Ireland, and the Azores. The Atlantic required different aircraft, larger, more powerful flying boats like the Boeing 314, with enough fuel capacity to make the long jumps between continents. By 1939, Pan Am operated 2 major transatlantic routes, the northern route through Ireland and the southern route through the Azores to Lisbon. These flights were glamorous, expensive, and celebrated worldwide. When a Pan Am flying boat landed in European waters, it was a diplomatic event. Journalists photographed the massive clippers as if they were ocean liners. Crowds flocked to see them. The world was watching aviation evolve in real time. Yet beneath the glamour lay risk. The Pacific and Atlantic crossings were dangerous. Weather was unpredictable, navigation uncertain, and mechanical failure often fatal. Pan Am lost several aircraft during these years, including the Samoan Clipper in 1938, which exploded during a fuel dump, killing Music and his entire crew. His loss was a heavy blow to the airline and to Trippe personally. But the momentum of global aviation was unstoppable, and Pan Am pushed forward. By the eve of World War II, Pan American Airways stood alone atop the aviation world. It had mastered 2 oceans, built infrastructure where none had existed, and established the first truly global airline network. No other carrier could match its reach or ambition. For a time, Pan Am was not just an airline, it was America's unofficial international flag carrier, its wings stretching across the planet. But the world was changing. As war loomed in Europe and tensions rose in Asia, Pan Am's global network was about to be drawn into a conflict far greater than anything Trippe had imagined. And while Pan Am adapted to wartime demands, it would soon find itself facing an even more formidable opponent than storms, distance, or technology. A changing world it could not fully control. By the end of World War II, Pan American Airways was no longer just a commercial airline. It had become a global instrument of American diplomacy, logistics, and influence. Its planes had ferried troops, equipment, spies, diplomats, and mail across continents. Its bases on remote islands had become military outposts, and its pilots, once civilian adventurers, had become some of the most experienced long-range aviators in the world. But the world that emerged from the war was profoundly different from the one Juan Trippe had dominated in the 1930s. Nations wanted their own flag carriers, aviation technology was advancing at unprecedented speed, and the American government, once content to let Pan Am operate as the de facto U.S. international airline, began to reconsider its monopoly. In this rapidly shifting environment, Pan Am faced both extraordinary opportunity and unprecedented challenges. The war had given the world a taste of long-range flying. Massive military transports like the C-54 had crossed oceans with surprising regularity. Airfields had sprung up from North Africa to the Pacific Islands, and radar, radio beacons, improved meteorology, and pressurized cabins had transformed aviation from dangerous experimentation into a legitimate form of global travel. Now, Pan Am sought to turn wartime necessity into peacetime luxury. Trippe's first goal was to modernize Pan Am's fleet. The airline invested heavily in new aircraft like the Lockheed Constellation and Douglas DC-6, sleek, pressurized, elegant machines that could fly higher, faster, and farther than the pre-war Clippers. With their graceful triple-tail design, the Constellations became icons of the early post-war years. They connected New York with London, Paris, Rome, and other major capitals with unprecedented speed. Flights that once required multiple days and several stops could now be completed in under 24 hours. Yet even as Pan Am expanded, cracks began to appear in its dominance. Foreign governments were determined to protect their own carriers. BOAC in Britain, Air France, KLM, Lufthansa, and a growing number of others. The U.S. Civil Aeronautics Board, facing pressure from domestic airlines, began granting overseas routes to competitors like TWA. For the first time, Pan Am was forced to defend its turf. Trippe understood that to maintain leadership, Pan Am needed to leap not one step, but an entire generation ahead of the competition. And that leap would come from a new kind of aircraft, one powered not by pistons, but by jet engines. The jet age had begun quietly during the war, but by the early 1950s, it was poised to transform global travel. Jets promised to fly twice as fast, twice as high, and far more smoothly than propeller-driven airliners. Early military jets proved the concept. Commercial jets would redefine the world. Trippe grasped this immediately. He believed the first airline to fully embrace jet technology would dominate international travel for decades. The competition to build a viable passenger jet was fierce. The British launched the de Havilland Comet in 1952, the world's first commercial jetliner. Its sleek design and quiet performance dazzled passengers. But structural failures soon caused catastrophic crashes, grounding the fleet and giving the Americans, Boeing and Douglas, a crucial advantage. Trippe moved aggressively. In 1955, Pan Am placed one of the largest aircraft orders in history, purchasing both the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8. It was a staggering financial gamble, but Trippe believed that jets would reshape everything: routes, pricing, passenger expectations, even geopolitics. For once, he was not merely correct, he was prophetic. On October 26, 1958, Pan Am inaugurated the first scheduled transatlantic jet service with the Boeing 707 Clipper America, flying from New York to Paris. Journalists and aviation enthusiasts hailed the event as a revolution. Passengers were stunned by how smooth and fast the journey felt. Instead of a full day, the flight took a little more than 7 hours, faster than some ocean liners took to load passengers. Pan Am had once again changed the world. The 707 became the symbol of a new era. Global travel was no longer a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The increased capacity and lower operating costs of jets brought prices down. Suddenly, a transatlantic flight was attainable for the middle class. Business travel expanded, tourism surged, and the world's cultural distances shrank. Pan Am aircraft, gleaming white with Blue Globe logos, became ambassadors of American commerce and culture in every major international airport. Pan Am's influence extended beyond aviation. In 1963, the company opened the Pan Am Building in New York City, then one of the largest office buildings in the world. Its name atop the Manhattan skyline symbolized not just corporate success, but the central role Pan Am played in shaping global mobility. The airline also expanded into hotels through its intercontinental network, giving Pan Am passengers safe, American-style accommodations in dozens of foreign capitals. Pan Am was more than a transportation company. It was a worldwide logistical ecosystem. Inside the aircraft, Pan Am service became legendary. Cabin interiors featured wide seats, gourmet meals, and attentive, stylish flight attendants who epitomized mid-century glamour. Advertising emphasized sophistication, exploration, and international elegance. From Hollywood films to news photographs, Pan Am became the airline associated with global adventure. A Pan Am ticket was both a mode of travel and a status symbol. Yet beneath the golden glow of the jet age, trouble was brewing. The very success of jet travel attracted more competition. Airlines like TWA, Air France, BOAC, and Lufthansa rapidly upgraded their fleets. Governments fortified their own national carriers, seeing aviation as both economic necessity and political leverage. Pan Am still held prestige, but no longer commanded total dominance. Still, Trippe pushed the company forward with a relentless, almost obsessive vision. The world had shrunk with the 707, but he dreamed of shrinking it even more. Planes, he believed, had to become bigger, more efficient, and capable of carrying far more passengers at lower cost. The next leap would be even larger than the last. And this time, the gamble would shape not only Pan Am's future, but the entire course of commercial aviation. It was in this moment, at the height of Pan Am's success, that Juan Trippe made the boldest decision of his career. A decision that would give the world the largest passenger aircraft ever built. A decision that would elevate Pan Am to unprecedented heights and ultimately contribute to its fall. By the late 1960s, American World Airways stood at the summit of global aviation. But beneath the polished exterior, the industry was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. Air travel was no longer an exotic luxury. The jet age had democratized the skies, increasing passenger volume but tightening profit margins. Governments were reshaping international routes, rivals were modernizing their fleets, and Pan Am, despite its prestige, faced mounting pressure to maintain its leadership. At the center of this storm stood Juan Trippe, now in his late 60s but still driven by the same restless ambition that had carried him across oceans decades earlier. He believed deeply that the future of aviation would not simply be faster jets or denser routes, but bigger airplanes, aircraft so large, so efficient, and so advanced that they would fundamentally reshape global travel. His vision was as bold as any in aviation history, and it would lead him to make the most consequential decision of his career. In 1966, Trippe approached Boeing with a radical proposal: build a passenger aircraft more than twice the size of the 707. The idea seemed almost absurd. No airline had ever filled an aircraft that large. Airports lacked the infrastructure, gates, tugs, jetways, to service it. Runways would require reinforcement. Training, maintenance, and logistics would need complete reinvention. But Trippe was convinced that a new generation of mass travel was coming, one that demanded capacity on a scale never seen before. Boeing hesitated. Then, suddenly, everything changed. The U.S. government funded the development of the supersonic transport, SST, which Boeing believed would dominate the future. Subsonic travel, they thought, might soon become obsolete. But the SST was years away, and Boeing needed steady revenue to survive the interim. Trippe knew this, and used it masterfully. He persuaded Boeing to build the plane that would become the Boeing 747. The initial order Pan Am placed was staggering: 25 aircraft at a cost of roughly $525 million, the largest single aircraft purchase in history at the time. The gamble was so enormous that industry analysts wondered whether even Pan Am, with all its global prestige, could survive such a financial commitment. Nevertheless, the 747 moved forward. Engineers in Everett, Washington built one of the largest buildings on Earth to assemble it. The design was revolutionary: a double-deck forward section, an upper lounge, 4 massive engines, unprecedented range, and a cabin wider than anything previously imagined. For the first time, air travel had the potential to resemble ocean liners: large, luxurious, capable of carrying entire plane loads of passengers across continents and oceans. Trippe envisioned the 747 not simply as a plane, but as an economic transformation. Its economy seats, far cheaper per mile than any earlier jet, would open global travel to millions of new passengers. But he miscalculated one critical element: the pace at which the world would adapt. Airports scrambled, painfully slowly, to expand gate areas and build new terminals. Air traffic systems lagged behind. And most critically, passenger demand did not grow at the speed Trippe predicted. On January 22, 1970, Pan Am flew the first commercial 747 service from New York to London. The moment was historic, an iconic milestone celebrated around the world. But behind the celebration lurked a harsh reality. The 747 was far more expensive to operate than any previous jet. It required enormous maintenance crews, vast quantities of fuel, and fully booked cabins to break even. And just as Pan Am began to fill its order, the global economy shifted. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo triggered an unprecedented spike in fuel prices. The 747, Trippe's masterpiece, was suddenly a financial burden. Every flight that failed to fill its hundreds of seats risked bleeding money. Smaller airlines with smaller aircraft weathered the crisis better. Pan Am, locked into a massive fleet of wide-bodies, struggled under the weight of fuel costs and debt payments. Simultaneously, the U.S. airline industry was approaching another seismic shock: deregulation. For decades, the government had tightly controlled fares and routes, protecting airlines from ruinous competition. But by the late 1970s, political pressure forced change. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 removed route and price controls, allowing carriers to compete freely and ruthlessly. Pan Am was catastrophically unprepared. It had never operated a domestic route network in the United States, apart from minimal internal segments. Competitors like United, Delta, and American had dense domestic hubs feeding passengers into their international flights. Pan Am, by contrast, had to rely almost entirely on point-to-point international traffic. After deregulation, this model was unsustainable. Desperate, Pan Am attempted a bold maneuver: the acquisition of National Airlines in 1980. The deal cost $437 million, an enormous sum, and was justified as a way to quickly establish a domestic network. But National's routes were poorly aligned with Pan Am's needs, and the merger triggered internal chaos. Two groups of pilots, Pan Am's and National's, fought bitterly over seniority rights, creating long-lasting divisions. Costs soared, morale collapsed, and operational inefficiencies multiplied. Meanwhile, the airline's global reputation, once unmatched, began to lose its shine. Passenger service declined. Maintenance suffered. Competition from rapidly modernizing rivals intensified. The 747, once Pan Am's symbol of superiority, now represented overcrowded terminals, mounting debt, and empty seats. Trippe retired in 1968, just before the 747 entered service. His departure left a leadership void no successor could fill. For decades, Pan Am's identity had been inseparable from Trippe himself: his ambition, his diplomacy, his vision. Without him, the airline lacked strategic coherence. The company he built had become too large, too complex, and too vulnerable. By the early 1980s, Pan Am was a shadow of its former self. It still operated glamorous routes: New York to London, Los Angeles to Tokyo, Frankfurt to New York, but profitability was slipping. Fuel spikes, recessions, international competition, and internal dysfunction were eroding its foundations. The grand empire of the skies was beginning to fracture, yet the airline's greatest challenges were still to come. Just as Pan Am entered the 1980s weakened and burdened, fate would deliver a series of blows, some economic, some political, and one unimaginably tragic, that would push the legendary carrier toward its final descent. The next chapter in Pan Am's story would not be defined by innovation or ambition, but by crisis, conflict, and catastrophe. By the dawn of the 1980s, American World Airways was no longer the unstoppable titan that had defined global aviation for half a century. It remained famous, even glamorous, but beneath the surface, the airline was bleeding, financially, structurally, and spiritually. The empire Juan Trippe had spent a lifetime building was now burdened by massive debt, a dysfunctional merger, rising fuel costs, and a competitive landscape reshaped by deregulation. But the decade ahead would deliver blows far more severe than any Pan Am had encountered before. In its final years, the world's most storied airline would be shaken by tragedy, trapped in geopolitical conflict, and ultimately overwhelmed by forces too powerful to resist. The first major blow of the 1980s came from within. The merger with National Airlines had failed so spectacularly that its consequences could be felt in every corner of the company. Two groups of pilots, those from Pan Am and those from National, waged an essentially permanent war over seniority. This was not a minor dispute. In the airline industry, seniority determines everything: pay, schedules, aircraft assignments, and job security. A pilot's entire professional life depends on it. The integration of National's pilots left both sides feeling betrayed. Lawsuits, grievances, bitterness, and strikes sapped the airline's morale and paralyzed its operations. Route integration was equally disastrous. National strengths lay in Florida and the Gulf Coast, regions poorly connected to Pan Am's international network. Gates didn't align, schedules didn't connect, and the airline never achieved the efficient hub and spoke system its domestic rivals used to dominate the post-deregulation market. Instead, Pan Am operated a patchwork of mismatched routes that hemorrhaged money. Fuel prices remained volatile throughout the early 1980s, and Pan Am's fleet, heavy with 747s and aging wide-bodies, was among the least efficient in the industry. Rising maintenance costs only deepened the crisis. Competitors introduced more fuel-efficient aircraft, modernized their cabins, reduced costs through smarter scheduling, and formed strategic alliances. Pan Am stood still, burdened by tradition and by a sprawling global identity it could no longer afford to maintain. Desperate for cash, the company began selling off the crown jewels of its network. In 1985, Pan Am sold its entire Pacific division, including routes to Tokyo, Sydney, and Hong Kong, to United Airlines for $750 million. This sale removed some of Pan Am's most profitable long-haul operations and severed a historic part of the airline's identity, but executives saw no alternative. Pan Am also sold pieces of its European and Caribbean operations, as well as the world-famous Intercontinental Hotels chain and the iconic Pan Am building in Manhattan. Each sale bought temporary relief and stripped away another layer of the empire Trippe had built. Even as the airline crumbled financially, it remained vulnerable to global events that directly affected international travel. In 1986, U.S. air travel was rattled by rising fears of terrorism. A bomb exploded on board a TWA flight over the Mediterranean. Airports tightened security. Passengers grew wary. Pan Am, with its heavy reliance on overseas routes and presence in the Middle East and Europe, was particularly exposed. But nothing could prepare the world, or Pan Am, for what would happen next. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 lifted off from London Heathrow on its journey to New York. The aircraft, a Boeing 747 named Clipper made of the seas, climbed into the cold winter sky carrying 259 passengers and crew. Less than an hour later, at 31,000 feet over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, a bomb detonated in the forward cargo hold. The explosion ripped the aircraft apart. All on board perished, along with 11 people on the ground. It remains one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history. The impact on Pan Am was catastrophic in every sense. Financially, the airline faced lawsuits, security overhauls, and unprecedented reputational damage. The media relentlessly questioned Pan Am's security practices. Passengers feared flying with the airline. Bookings collapsed. International travelers avoided Pan Am flights, even on routes unrelated to Europe. Though Pan Am had not planted the bomb, the public associated the tragedy directly with the airline. Politically, the aftermath of Lockerbie became entangled in geopolitics involving Libya, the U.S. government, and European intelligence agencies. For Pan Am, already weakened, the attack was a mortal wound. And yet the airline fought on, refusing to surrender, but the final blow was already forming. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War. Fuel prices surged once again. Passenger demand, especially for international travel, collapsed worldwide. Insurance costs skyrocketed. Flights were canceled, routes were cut, aircraft were grounded. For Pan Am, dependent on long-haul international travel to survive, the crisis was devastating. The airline attempted one last lifeline, a sale of its European routes and assets at Frankfurt Airport to Delta Airlines, combined with an ambitious plan to restructure and rebuild a smaller, more efficient Pan Am focused on the East Coast and the Caribbean. Delta initially supported the plan, providing financing and operational assistance. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Pan Am might be reborn, not as the global titan it had once been, but as a leaner, modern airline. But by late 1991, the numbers told a bleak story. Losses mounted. Investors fled. Delta withdrew further support. Pan Am's internal operations were faltering under the strain of bankruptcy, staff shortages, maintenance delays, and rising costs. Employees, who had worked for months with reduced pay and no certainty about the future, clung to hope, but the doors were closing. On December 3, 1991, Pan Am flew its final scheduled flight, Miami to Bridgetown, then onward to New York as Clipper Goodwill. The next day, December 4, Pan American World Airways ceased all operations. After 64 years of pioneering achievements, glamorous flights, and unforgettable milestones, the world's most famous airline was gone. Its end was met with a mixture of shock, sorrow, and disbelief. Former employees wept as the company's signs were removed from terminals. Aviation enthusiasts wrote tributes. Newspapers around the world carried headlines marking the end of an era. Pan Am had taught the world to fly, opened the Pacific, conquered the Atlantic, launched the jet age, democratized international travel, and helped build the very infrastructure that modern aviation still relies on. Yet no airline, not even one built on vision and ambition, could survive the combined weight of deregulation, financial collapse, geopolitical upheaval, and terrorism. Today, Pan Am lives on not as a company, but as a legend. Its blue globe logo remains one of the most iconic symbols in aviation history. Its aircraft appear in countless films. Its former employees still gather for reunions. Its pioneering spirit continues in the global networks and aircraft technologies it helped create. Pan Am's story is not simply a corporate rise and fall. It is the story of modern aviation itself, the triumphs, the risks, the ambition, the fragility, and the astonishing complexity of connecting the world through flight. In its greatest moments, Pan Am shrank oceans, bridged continents, and brought nations closer. And even in its final moments, it embodied the daring spirit that defined the entire 20th century. Pan Am did not just fly people across the world. It changed the world forever.